Wrong lane, the range officer muttered. No clearance, no file. You sure you're even supposed to be here? She didn't flinch, just handed over her ID. They laughed until the terminal scanned it and flashed red. Night Viper reactivated. The room froze. No more smirks. No more snide remarks because the system hadn't just cleared her. It had reactivated something most of them only knew through whispers and classified rumors. Want to uncover the secret behind Night Viper and why seasoned soldiers lost their words? Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from here on Graceful Valor Stories. And make sure you're subscribed because this story doesn't unfold the way anyone expected. The morning air at Joint Training Site Echo 4 tasted like diesel exhaust and determination. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the intake facility, casting that harsh institutional glow that made everyone look either too pale or too tired. The smell of industrial coffee mixed with the metallic tang of gun oil drifting from the range complex beyond. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic pop, pop, pop of live fire exercises provided a steady percussion that had been Echo 4's soundtrack since 0600. The intake queue moved like bureaucracy always did, slowly, with frequent stops for paperwork that could have been handled digitally if anyone cared enough to upgrade the system. Soldiers in partial gear shifted their weight from boot to boot, some checking phones, others staring at motivational posters that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. A private near the front had managed to spill coffee across the intake desk and was now attempting damage control with the sleeve of his fleece, spreading the stain more than cleaning it. That's when she walked in. Ever wonder what secrets a quiet figure like her could be hiding? Stick with us. The revelation will leave you speechless, here on Graceful Valor Stories. Tessa Rayner moved through the heavy glass doors with the kind of economy that suggested she'd done this before, though not recently. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape without making a show of it. Her field fatigues were regulation but generic. No unit patches, no rank insignia, no colorful tabs that marked her as belonging to anything important. The fabric was worn soft at the stress points, suggesting genuine use rather than weekend warrior cosplay. Her dark green rucksack hung from one shoulder with that particular drape that came from being packed by someone who understood weight distribution. Not overstuffed, not underpacked, just functional. Her combat boots had that broken-in quality that spoke of miles walked rather than hours polished, scuffed at the toe and heel but still holding their shape. Everything about her was carefully unremarkable, the kind of person who could stand in a crowd of soldiers and disappear into the background noise of military routine. Staff Sergeant Kowalski barely glanced up from his terminal when she reached the intake desk. His coffee cup proclaimed him world's okayest NCO in fading letters, and his expression suggested he was living down to that standard. "Name?" he asked, fingers already poised over keys that had seen better decades. Tessa handed over a laminated ID badge, the kind that looked official enough to pass casual inspection but wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. The barcode along the bottom was slightly off-center, like it had been printed on equipment that needed calibration. Tessa Rayner, civilian observer. Kowalski fed the badge into his reader, which made the tired electronic wheeze of government equipment held together by contractor maintenance and wishful thinking. The scanner rejected it twice before finally flashing green, probably more from persistence than accuracy. "You with a contractor?" he asked, squinting at his screen like the pixels were personally offending him. "No." "Dense consulting firm?" "No, one of those military spouse education programs." Tessa shook her head with the patience of someone who'd expected this conversation. "Just here to observe the range rotations." Kowalski's snort carried just enough derision to be insulting without crossing into actionable territory. "Right. Observer pass logged. You'll be assigned to Delta Sector. Observation lanes only. No live rounds, no engagement zones, no interactive stations." He raised his eyebrows with the universal expression of bureaucratic superiority. "We clear on that, Crystal?" she said. Behind her in the queue, someone muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Didn't know we let auditors in during training cycles." "Probably somebody's wife," another voice chimed in with the casual cruelty that passed for humor in young men who'd never been held accountable for their assumptions. Here to make sure we're not having too much fun with the boom boom sticks. A cluster of recruits had drifted over from the equipment check-in, drawn by the promise of entertainment. Private Caulfield led the pack, 22 years old, built like a vending machine, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from being the biggest guy in his hometown. He nudged his buddy Morrison with an elbow that probably left a bruise. $10 says she brought protein bars and a first aid kit, Caulfield stage whispered. Morrison grinned back. 20 says she asked if there's a quiet place to set up her laptop. From behind them, Lieutenant Dyer emerged with the fluid authority of someone who'd figured out that being an officer meant never having to admit he didn't know what was happening. Late 20s, regulation haircut that looked like it cost more than most privates made in a week. Sleeves rolled precisely to mid-forearm to display the range qualification patch he'd earned 6 months ago. He carried a clipboard like it was a sword, and his smirk suggested he'd found something amusing in the morning's routine. "Better make sure she signs the noise waiver," he announced, loud enough for the gallery. "Wouldn't want anyone going full Karen when the artillery demonstration starts." The laughter that followed had that particular edge that came when junior officers tried to be one of the guys while still pulling rank. Not quite cruel, but sharp enough to draw blood if you let it. Tessa accepted her laminated visitor pass from Kowalski, clipped it to her collar with movements that were precise without being military crisp, and nodded once. No smile, no frown, no visible reaction to the commentary flowing around her like water around a stone. Delta Sector was where they put the harmless observers. Mostly static targets, simulated response drills, and firewatch lanes designed to give visitors a taste of military life without the inconvenience of actual danger. It was the kiddie pool of combat training, complete with safety rails and instructors who specialized in explaining why everything was louder than expected. Tessa walked the perimeter without hesitation, bypassing the folding chairs and industrial-strength hearing protection offered at the welcome kiosk. She found a position about 20 feet behind the active lanes, just outside the yellow safety line that marked the boundary between spectators and participants. Corporal Hayes, manning the safety station, cocked his head as he watched her settle into position. "She looks like she's about to start taking notes for a harassment complaint." Caulfield had followed the group to Delta Sector, apparently finding Tessa's presence more entertaining than whatever training exercise he was supposed to be participating in. Maybe she's here to teach mindfulness meditation, finding inner peace through controlled explosions. "Think she'll want to interview us about our feelings?" Morrison added, earning another round of chuckles from the assembled peanut gallery. Lieutenant Dyer appeared at the observation rail, clipboard tucked under his arm with the kind of casual authority that suggested he'd never had to carry anything heavier. His voice carried clearly across the sector when he called out, "You evaluating our technique, ma'am? Or just taking notes for the suggestion box?" Tessa didn't turn around. Neither. The single-word response seemed to deflate some of the momentum, but Dyer wasn't ready to let the moment pass. "Well, don't get in the way when we start the live exercises. Wouldn't want you slipping on a brass casing and filing an incident report, huh?" More laughter from the crowd, though it felt a little forced now, like they were working harder to maintain the joke than the joke deserved. To anyone watching without context, Tessa Rayner looked exactly like what she claimed to be. A civilian observer with no particular qualifications beyond curiosity and whatever connections had gotten her through the gate. Her fatigues were regulation, but unremarkable. Her posture was attentive, but not military precise. Her only distinguishing characteristic was an almost preternatural stillness, like someone who'd learned that unnecessary movement was a luxury she couldn't afford. She didn't check her phone, didn't take notes, didn't fidget or shift or show any of the restless energy that marked most visitors to military facilities. She just watched the range with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was cataloging more than the casual observer would notice. When the live fire rotation began, her gaze didn't follow the shooters like most spectators. Instead, she tracked the patterns, firing arcs, sight lines, the rhythm of reload and reposition. Her eyes moved with the precision of someone reading a language most people didn't know existed. Tech specialist Rodriguez noticed it first. He'd been monitoring the sector from the control booth, part of his job being to watch for safety violations and civilian stupidity in equal measure. But Tessa's attention wasn't the unfocused gawking of someone watching an action movie. It was analytical, professional, like someone reviewing work she understood intimately. When the rotation ended and the teams broke for equipment maintenance, she moved not toward the restrooms or the snack stand or any of the usual civilian destinations. She walked directly toward the biometric access console at the sector's inner perimeter. The console was a relic from an earlier security upgrade, brushed aluminum and black glass that looked impressive but rarely worked properly. Most personnel avoided it unless specifically required for their duties, knowing that the finicky biometric reader would probably reject them 3 times before grudgingly admitting they existed. Tessa stood in front of it for a moment, studying the interface like she was solving a puzzle. Then she extended her left wrist toward the scanner. Rodriguez emerged from the control booth, partly curious and partly concerned that someone was about to trigger a security alert he'd have to explain in triplicate. "That's not how this works," he said, approaching with the patient tone of someone who spent most of his day explaining technology to people who'd grown up before the internet. "Guest IDs don't interface with biometrics. This system is restricted. Combat personnel only." Tessa looked down at the scanner, then back at Rodriguez. "Override access." He chuckled, the sound carrying just enough condescension to remind everyone within earshot that he was the expert here. "Right. Unless you're special forces or part of some black ops unit I've never heard of, I think you're barking up the wrong tree." Someone behind them, probably Caulfield, called out with mock concern. "That chip even real? Or did you get it from one of those underground tattoo places?" The question got another laugh, though it was starting to feel forced. The entertainment value of mocking the civilian observer was wearing thin, but nobody wanted to be the first to admit it. That's when Chief Warrant Officer Brenner stepped forward from the inner lane access corridor. Brenner was the kind of soldier who didn't need to announce his presence. 54 years old with deep-set eyes that had seen enough stupidity to fill several field manuals, and a voice like gravel soaked in coffee that had been brewing since the Reagan administration. His duty vest was worn but functional, carrying the kind of equipment that suggested he still spent time in places where theory met reality in violent ways. He'd been watching the show for the last 20 minutes, saying nothing, taking mental notes on who was participating and who was just enjoying the spectacle. Now he moved with the deliberate purpose of someone who'd reached a decision. Without speaking, he stepped past Rodriguez and tapped the biometric scanner twice, a specific sequence that bypassed the normal startup routine and activated diagnostic mode. Then he looked at Tessa with eyes that seemed to be reading information nobody else could see. "Try it," he said quietly. She placed her palm against the glass scanner, which hummed to life with an electronic tone nobody had heard before. The usual amber standby light flickered, then went dark for several seconds that stretched like held breath. Then, everything changed. A low, clean tone sounded, not the usual cheerful beep of successful identification, but something deeper, more serious. Red lights strobed once across the ceiling, just long enough to make everyone look up and wonder if they should be concerned. Every screen along the control console flickered in sequence, like dominoes falling in precise order. The main display went black for a heartbeat, then blazed to life with text that made Rodriguez step backward involuntarily. ID confirmed. Night Viper reactivated. The words hung on the screen in bold, unmistakable letters that seemed to burn themselves into everyone's vision. Below them, cascading lines of code scrolled past too quickly to read, but the headers were clear enough to make people uncomfortable. Classified archive access granted. Legacy operator protocols. Active observer status overridden. Rodriguez felt his mouth go dry. What the hell is Night Viper? A recruit near the back whispered urgently to his buddy, "Is this some kind of drill?" But Brenner hadn't moved. His arms were crossed now, and his gaze never left Tessa's face. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that other people lived or died by. "No drill," he said. "No glitch, no mistake." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the range seemed to fade, leaving only the hum of electronics and the sound of people trying to process information that didn't fit any category they understood. Tessa turned away from the console without acknowledging the screen full of alerts and authorization codes. She walked toward the inner wall of the sector, past idle shooters, who suddenly found their weapons very interesting, and stopped at a terminal that hadn't been touched in weeks. The pattern recognition console was military hardware that most people didn't have clearance to even look at directly. It was used by senior instructors to design advanced training scenarios, analyze threat movements, and develop adaptive response protocols. The interface was deliberately intimidating, black screens and incomprehensible menus that discouraged casual exploration. Tessa sat down in front of it like she was returning to a favorite chair. "What the hell is she doing?" Dyer asked, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The clipboard in his hands might as well have been a child's toy for all the authority it represented. "Lieutenant," Brenner said quietly without turning around, "shut up." Tessa's fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, not hunting and pecking, not the careful two-finger typing of someone learning a new system. Her hands flowed across the keys like water, each keystroke placed exactly where it needed to be without conscious thought. The screen responded immediately, displaying tactical maps that most people in the room had never seen before. Legacy battlefield layouts from operations that didn't officially exist. Static defense perimeters from joint task doctrines that had been classified above their security level. She rotated the displays, layered tactical overlays on top of terrain maps, and began sketching movement patterns with 2 fingers on the touchscreen. The system started flagging her inputs with designations that made Rodriguez feel sick to his stomach. Legacy Movement Protocol Tier X. Combat Signature Match, 98.2%. Ghost Protocol, detected. Archive synchronization. "She's not training," someone whispered. "She's remembering." Tessa zoomed into a specific section of the tactical display and input a series of commands that caused every auxiliary screen in the sector to freeze momentarily. When they came back online, they were displaying information that hadn't been accessible through normal channels. A prompt appeared that made everyone in the room suddenly aware they were witnessing something far beyond their pay grade. Request Autonomous Range Upgrade. Code Night Viper authorized. System uploading new doctrine. Warning sirens chimed softly throughout the facility. The camera feeds across Delta Sector shifted from standard monitoring to what looked like active threat assessment. Every shooter's heads-up display interface recalibrated automatically, downloading tactical packages that most of them didn't have clearance to access. "She's rewriting our entire training protocol," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In real time, without authorization codes." "She has authorization," Brenner corrected. "You just didn't recognize it." Caulfield, who had gone very quiet very quickly, finally found his voice. "Night Viper was just a project designation, right? Some kind of research thing they shut down years ago." The tech specialist who had been monitoring the console inputs looked up from his screen with the expression of someone who just realized he was way over his head. Night Viper wasn't a project. It was an operator classification. Deep infiltration, no unit markers, high clearance operations, all field personnel, no support structure, no extraction protocols. Dyer shook his head, still trying to process what he was seeing. "I thought they discontinued that program after the Havoc breach incident." "They did," Brenner said, his voice carrying weight that made everyone listen officially. A beat of silence that stretched like a held breath. "Then why is the system showing hers reactivated?" Morrison asked, his earlier swagger completely gone. Nobody answered because nobody had an answer that made sense within the framework of what they thought they knew about military organization and protocol. Tessa input the final sequence of commands and the simulation executed flawlessly. The tactical display showed a complex breach scenario collapsing in 17 seconds with surgical precision that eliminated all hostile targets without a single casualty among friendly forces. It was clean, efficient, and completely impossible according to everything they'd been taught about small unit tactics. When the simulation ended, she stood up from the console with the same deliberate movements she'd shown since arriving. No celebration, no acknowledgement of what she'd just accomplished, just the professional satisfaction of someone who'd completed a task that needed doing.
Brenner approached, but he didn't salute or offer formal recognition. He just stood close enough to speak without being overheard by the crowd of suddenly uncertain soldiers watching from a respectful distance. "Nobody's logged into that system since 2012, he said quietly, and the last authorized user was listed as missing in action. Tessa met his eyes with the kind of direct gaze that most people found uncomfortable. Paperwork gets misfiled. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she was saying. "You need anything?" "10 minutes alone," she said. "Then I disappear." Brenner turned to address the crowd of soldiers who were still trying to process what they'd witnessed. His voice carried clearly across the sector, cutting through whispered speculation and nervous energy. Everyone not directly involved in range operations needs to find somewhere else to be right now. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Within minutes, Delta Sector had cleared except for essential personnel and the few individuals whose clearance levels allowed them to witness what was happening. Tessa returned to the pattern recognition console, but this time she knelt beside it and slid open an access panel that most people didn't know existed. Inside was a sealed port that looked older than any standard military equipment. She connected a small encrypted module from her rucksack, hardware that predated current security protocols by at least a decade. The system didn't reject the connection. Instead, it welcomed it like a dog recognizing its owner after a long absence. The main screen flared red with text that made Rodriguez consider whether he should be documenting this or pretending it never happened. Night Viper command privileges restored. Mission tracking enabled. Advanced tactical protocols uploaded. New training scenarios began populating automatically. Not the standard exercises they'd been running, but sophisticated multi-layer simulations that adapt in real time to operator responses. The kind of training that had been theoretical until now. "She's not just updating our systems," Rodriguez whispered to himself. "She's teaching them." When Tessa finished, she packed her equipment back into the rucksack with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The console continued running autonomous training scenarios, each one more complex than anything the facility had been capable of before her arrival. She hadn't fired a single shot, hadn't raised her voice or made demands or threatened anyone's authority. And yet every soldier in the facility was now standing at attention without being ordered to do so because something deep in their training recognized that they were in the presence of someone whose service transcended normal categories. The door to the console area clicked open with electronic precision. Tessa stepped out into the main sector where a small crowd had gathered despite Brenner's dismissal order. They parted automatically as she approached, not from fear, but from a respect they couldn't quite articulate. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as she passed, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there an hour earlier. She paused briefly, acknowledging him with a slight nod, then continued toward the sector exit. No fanfare, no speeches, no acknowledgement of the chaos she'd quietly resolved. Brenner caught up with her at the threshold. "The systems logged your protocols as Operator Doctrine X11. There's nothing comparable in our databases." "Good," she said simply. "Command's going to want explanations when they see the upgrade notifications." Tessa looked back at the sector where soldiers were beginning to explore the new training capabilities with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "They'll adapt, they always do. And if they try to track you down, they won't find what they're looking for." She said Night Viper was a designation, not a person. She shouldered her rucksack and walked toward the main exit, leaving behind a facility that looked exactly the same but functioned at a completely different level. The upgrade she'd installed would improve training efficiency, reduce casualties, and prepare soldiers for scenarios they couldn't have imagined before. At the intake desk, Sergeant Kowalski was staring at his terminal with the expression of someone who just discovered that reality was more complicated than his paperwork suggested. Her visitor log had been automatically updated with classifications he didn't have clearance to understand. "Ma'am," he said as she approached, standing up with the kind of respect he hadn't shown earlier. "The system's asking for debriefing protocols, but I don't have." Tessa placed her visitor pass on the desk. "Mark it as routine observation." "Nothing else but the upgrade log show." "Mark it as routine," she repeated, her voice carrying quiet finality. Kowalski nodded quickly and began typing, his earlier casual attitude replaced by the careful professionalism of someone who'd realized he was dealing with forces beyond his understanding. As Tessa walked toward the exit, Brenner watched from the sector doorway. He'd spent 30 years in the military, had worked with special operations units most people never heard of, and had thought he understood the full spectrum of what the service demanded from its people. Now he was reconsidering those assumptions. When the door closed behind her, he turned back to the pattern recognition console where new training scenarios were still generating automatically. Each one bore the same discrete signature in the lower corner. OPID 0910V. The identifier meant nothing to anyone else, but Brenner had seen enough classified documents to recognize a ghost signature when he saw one. Someone who existed in the system but couldn't be traced through normal channels. Someone whose service record was maintained in archives that officially didn't exist. That evening, word spread through the facility in the way that significant information always traveled in military communities, quietly, person to person, without official documentation or formal announcements. By lights out, every soldier on the base had heard some version of the story about the civilian observer who turned out to be something else entirely. In the mess hall, conversations stopped and started around the name that nobody was quite sure they were allowed to say out loud. Night Viper, the designation that had appeared on screens that morning and then vanished from the official record, as if it had never existed. Rodriguez found himself researching tactical protocols he'd never heard of, discovering references to operations that were heavily redacted or missing entirely from the databases he had access to. The deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that Tessa Rayner represented something that existed in the spaces between official recognition and necessary action.
Lieutenant Dwyer sat alone at a corner table, his meal untouched, staring at the tactical manuals he'd been so confident about that morning. The new training protocols Tessa had uploaded made his previous understanding of small unit tactics look like elementary school homework. Later that night, after the facility had settled into its normal evening routine, a young private logged into the training system and found a new file waiting in his personal folder. File name: Advanced Movement Doctrine, Rayner Modification. Status: Recommended Training Classification Level, Redacted. He opened it expecting another boring PowerPoint presentation about proper equipment maintenance or safety protocols. Instead, he found tactical scenarios that challenged everything he thought he knew about combat operations, movements that were possible but not obvious, strategies that achieved objectives through precision rather than overwhelming force. At the bottom of the file was a single line of text: "The most dangerous opponents are the ones you don't see coming." The private bookmarked the file and began working through the scenarios, wondering who else on the base had encountered the quiet woman who'd spent a few hours rewriting their understanding of what was possible. In the morning, when shift supervisors checked the facility's operational status, they found that every system was running at peak efficiency. Equipment that had been temperamental was now functioning flawlessly. Training protocols that had been adequate were now exceptional. The official logs showed no unauthorized access, no security breaches, no unusual activity of any kind. Just another routine day at a military training facility where personnel worked to prepare for challenges they hoped they'd never face. But the soldiers who'd been there knew better. They'd witnessed something that couldn't be categorized or explained through normal channels. They'd seen a ghost return to life, complete an impossible task, and disappear back into whatever shadows had hidden her for the past decade. And they'd learned that sometimes the most important people in any organization were the ones whose names didn't appear on organizational charts, whose service couldn't be quantified in normal terms, and whose contributions could only be measured by the lives they saved and the missions they made possible. Night Viper had come home, if only for a few hours, but the echo of her presence would last much longer in training protocols that prepared soldiers for scenarios they couldn't imagine, and in the quiet understanding that legends sometimes walked among them, disguised as ordinary people with extraordinary capabilities. The system remembered what others had tried to forget, and that memory would keep them all sharper, more prepared, and more alive when the impossible became inevitable. Have you ever completely misjudged someone based on first impressions? What would you do if the person everyone was laughing at turned out to be the most qualified person in the room? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Hit that like button if this story reminded you that respect should be given freely until someone proves they don't deserve it. Subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss these stories about quiet heroes who walk among us, here on Graceful Valor Stories.
Share this with someone who knows that the most dangerous people are often the ones who don't need to prove how dangerous they are. Another story about hidden legends is waiting on your screen right now. We'll see you there, and we'll see you tomorrow, right here on Graceful Valor Stories.